Mr. Howard was a man everyone in the city knew. He was the CEO of a large company that dealt with technology and big projects. Many people called him a genius in business, and his name often appeared in newspapers with titles like the Millionaire Leader of Tomorrow. That evening, Mr. Howard had planned something very important. He had invited a group of investors to an expensive restaurant in the heart of the city. The investors were from overseas, and they were interested in a huge deal that could be worth almost $200 million. For Mr. Howard, it was not only about money, it was about power and pride. If he could win these people over, his company would grow faster than ever before. The restaurant was a place of soft golden lights, quiet music, and tables decorated with fresh flowers. Expensive paintings hung on the walls, and the floor shone as though it had been polished just for this night. Every guest at the restaurant knew that dining here was a sign of wealth. The investors arrived in fine suits, and Mr. Howard greeted them with a wide smile. He shook their hands firmly and led them to a private dining table that had been reserved only for them. The table was long, with white linen, crystal glasses, and shining silverware. As the men sat down, they noticed a young waitress stepping forward. She was wearing a neat black and white uniform, her hair tied back simply. Her name was Grace. She worked at the restaurant every evening after school, helping her mother pay the bills. She was soft-spoken but confident in her work. Though she did not have much, she carried herself with dignity. Grace approached the table with a smile. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome. May I bring you water or something else to start with?" Her voice was gentle, and her words were clear. The investors smiled at her politeness. One of them even said, "Water will be perfect, thank you." But Mr. Howard, who was sitting at the head of the table, barely looked at her. He was busy adjusting his expensive watch and tapping his fingers on the table. His eyes kept moving toward the investors, as if he wanted all of their attention. When Grace left to bring the drinks, the investors spoke softly to one another about the city and the upcoming deal. Mr. Howard tried to keep the conversation flowing, speaking about his company's projects, profits, and plans for the future. He spoke quickly, filling the air with his own words, not noticing that the investors were listening politely but quietly. Grace returned with the tray of water glasses. She set each glass carefully in front of the guests, her hands steady though the tray was a little heavy. When she placed the last glass before Mr. Howard, he gave her a quick nod without a word, still speaking to his guests about numbers and growth charts. For Grace, this was just another night at work. She had no idea that the people sitting at the table were about to make one of the biggest decisions of their lives. All she knew was that she must do her job well, smile, serve, and make sure everyone felt comfortable. The first course was ordered. Grace wrote it down neatly, checked that everything was correct, and hurried to the kitchen. The investors watched her for a moment. There was something natural in her calmness, something honest in the way she carried herself. When she returned with the dishes, she served them with the same quiet grace. She placed the plates before the men, offering them warm bread on the side. She even wished them a pleasant meal before stepping back with a polite bow. The investors thanked her, but Mr. Howard hardly noticed. His mind was on the deal, on the future numbers he imagined. He thought to himself, if I impress them enough, they will not hesitate to sign tomorrow. As dinner continued, the room filled with the soft sound of cutlery and quiet talk. Mr. Howard kept boasting about his leadership, about how his employees always followed him, and about how he never allowed mistakes in his company. The investors listened carefully, but they were also observant people. They were not only interested in profits, they wanted to see the man behind the business. Character, to them, was as important as skill. And so, while Mr. Howard believed he was showing his strength through words, the investors were silently watching something else: the little details, the way he treated people around him, the way he reacted to small things. Grace, unaware of their thoughts, continued her work around the restaurant. Sometimes she refilled glasses, sometimes she checked if everything was fine. She always carried the same calm smile, even when her legs ached from hours of walking. The evening stretched on, and the main course was about to be served. The investors leaned back in their chairs, satisfied with the food but still thoughtful about the man in front of them. They had heard his numbers, but they had not yet seen his heart. And soon, without knowing it, Mr. Howard was about to reveal it. The main course was ready, and the waiters moved quickly through the restaurant with trays. Grace carried one of the heavier trays, balanced carefully in her hands. On it were the dishes for Mr. Howard and his important guests. She walked slowly and steadily toward the table, her mind repeating the order in silence so she would not forget anything. The investors were still speaking softly to one another, asking Mr. Howard questions about his company's future. He answered with strong words, explaining how fast his projects were growing and how others in the industry followed his lead. He sat tall, his voice full of pride, certain that he was winning their admiration. Grace reached the table and began to serve. One by one, she placed the dishes before the guests. The plates were heavy, but she moved with care, making sure not to disturb their conversation. When she came to the last plate, something small happened. She placed the wrong side dish in front of Mr. Howard. Instead of the roasted vegetables he had asked for, she had brought mashed potatoes. It was a small mistake, something that could be fixed quickly. But the moment Mr. Howard saw it, his face hardened. He stopped speaking mid-sentence, staring at the plate as though it had insulted him. Grace noticed and quickly said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. Let me change this right away." She reached to take the plate back, ready to correct the order. But Mr. Howard did not let it go. He leaned back in his chair, his voice sharp. "How difficult is it to follow one simple instruction?" His tone cut through the air, silencing the gentle music of the restaurant. The investors froze. Their forks paused midair. They looked at Mr. Howard, then at Grace, who stood with the plate in her hands, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. She bowed her head slightly. "I apologize. I'll bring the correct dish immediately." Her voice was steady, though inside her chest her heart beat faster. She had been working long hours that day, and one mistake had slipped through, but she wanted only to fix it. Mr. Howard, however, was not satisfied. He shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable. Some people can't even handle the simplest task." The words carried across the table, heavy and unkind. Grace did not reply. She quietly picked up the plate and walked away, holding herself tall even though she felt small inside. Every step to the kitchen felt longer than usual. She had learned, over time, that answering back only made things worse. So she chose silence and dignity. The restaurant itself seemed to notice the moment. A hush had fallen over the nearby tables. Diners who had caught the tone looked at one another but said nothing. The investors, however, were not silent in their thoughts. They had been watching Mr. Howard carefully all evening, studying not only his words about business but also his behavior. And now, without warning, they had been given a clear window into his character. One investor, Mr. Daniel, lowered his fork and sat back, his eyes thoughtful. He had built his career not only on numbers but also on judging people's values. He thought to himself, if he cannot treat a young waitress with respect, how will he treat us when we disagree with him? The others at the table also exchanged subtle glances. They did not speak openly, but they all felt the same change in the air. Mr. Howard, however, seemed unaware of what he had done. He continued talking as Grace disappeared into the kitchen. He waved his hand as though brushing away a small fly, saying, "Anyway, as I was explaining, our profits are growing at a record pace. The market trusts me completely." The investors listened politely, but something inside them had shifted. The glow of confidence they had seen in him earlier was now clouded by the shadow of arrogance. In the kitchen, Grace placed the wrong plate down and asked the chef for the correct one. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to breathe. She reminded herself why she worked: her mother's medicine bills, her younger brother's school fees, her own dream of one day running a small cafe. One customer's harsh words could not take away her purpose. When the correct dish was ready, she carried it back to the table. Her steps were just as steady, her voice just as polite when she said, "Here is your meal, sir." The investors noticed her calmness. Not once did she show anger or disrespect, even after being spoken to so harshly. She set the plate before Mr. Howard, gave a polite smile, and quietly stepped back. The dinner continued, but the mood was different now. The investors were no longer just hearing Mr. Howard's numbers, they were hearing the echo of his tone. They were no longer looking only at his charts, they were looking at the way he treated those who could not give him anything in return. And though Mr. Howard thought he was still impressing them, he did not realize that the deal he desired so much had just begun to slip away because of a single moment, a single choice of words. After the small incident at the table, the evening at the restaurant slowly moved forward. The music continued to play softly, and other diners went back to their quiet conversations. But at Mr. Howard's table, the investors were no longer fully listening to his words. Their minds kept going back to the way he had spoken to Grace. Grace herself returned to her usual duties. She reminded herself, as she always did, that she must stay calm no matter what happened. A waitress's job was not easy. Long hours, heavy trays, and demanding customers could wear anyone down, but she had promised herself that she would never let bitterness control her heart. Her mother often told her, "Grace, the world may not always be kind, but you can choose to be kind in return. That is your strength." Those words lived in her like a soft light. Not long after she had set the correct dish for Mr. Howard, another table nearby needed attention. A young couple had spilled a glass of water by accident. The glass tipped over, and the cold water ran across the tablecloth, dripping onto the woman's dress. She looked embarrassed, while the man quickly tried to fix it with napkins. Grace hurried over with a warm smile. "It's all right. Don't worry at all," she said gently. She brought fresh napkins, helped them dry the table, and offered to move their dishes to a clean table if they preferred. The young couple looked relieved at her calmness. "Thank you," the woman said softly. "You've saved our evening." Grace only smiled again. "It's my job to make sure you enjoy your time here." She then replaced the wet tablecloth with a clean one, her movements quick but graceful. In just a few minutes, the problem had vanished, and the couple could laugh again, free from embarrassment. From across the room, Mr. Daniel, one of the investors, had been watching this quietly. He saw how Grace handled the situation with patience and kindness. She had not made the couple feel foolish for the accident, instead, she gave them comfort. To him, this showed more leadership than all of Mr. Howard's proud words. At another moment in the evening, Grace noticed an elderly man struggling to read the menu because his glasses were missing. She crouched slightly beside him, reading out the options in a clear and respectful voice. The man smiled gratefully, saying, "You've made my night easier, young lady." Again, Mr. Daniel noticed. Grace treated everyone equally, whether they were a wealthy customer, a young couple, or an old man with weak eyes. She gave them all respect. Back at the private table, Mr. Howard was still speaking of profits and numbers. He talked about his success as though it were written in stone. The investors nodded politely, but their attention kept wandering. Every time Grace passed by, they watched her, noticing her soft strength. It was a quiet comparison, but an important one. On one side sat a man who thought only of himself, who demanded attention and gave little respect. On the other side walked a young woman who worked long hours, who carried no wealth but carried dignity in her heart. The contrast was impossible to ignore. As the night drew on, the investors began whispering to one another in their own language when Mr. Howard turned his head away. They did not speak about profits now. They spoke about character, about trust, about what they had seen in that restaurant that evening. Mr. Howard believed he was impressing them with his knowledge, but he had already lost their hearts. Grace, without knowing it, was the one showing them the values they truly cared about: patience, kindness, and respect for others. Later in the evening, when dessert was being served, Grace brought the plates carefully. She placed each one with the same care as before, smiling as though nothing had gone wrong earlier. She even said, "I hope you enjoy this. It is one of our best." Her words were simple, but they carried warmth. The investors thanked her sincerely. One of them, Mr. Daniel, gave her a longer look, almost as if he wanted to say something more. But he stayed silent for the moment, only watching her walk away with the same calm step. For Grace, this was just another night of work, one of many evenings she would spend balancing trays and offering smiles. She had no idea that her simple acts of kindness were making a deeper impact than she could imagine. She did not know that the investors were silently comparing her behavior to the man who wanted their millions. By the end of the meal, Mr. Howard leaned back in his chair, satisfied. In his mind, the evening had been a success. He believed the investors were impressed by his boldness, his vision, and his endless talk of profits. He thought tomorrow would bring him the deal he dreamed of. But the investors were quiet as they stood to leave. They shook hands with him politely, but their minds were elsewhere. The image they would carry with them that night was not his confident smile, but the quiet dignity of the young waitress who had shown them what true character looked like. And so, without realizing it, Mr. Howard's fate had already begun to turn. The decision that would change his future was not being shaped by his numbers, but by the memory of how he had treated someone he thought was unimportant. The dinner finally came to an end. The tables around the restaurant were slowly emptying, and the lights had dimmed to a softer glow. The quiet sound of music continued to play in the background, but at Mr. Howard's table, the evening felt heavier than before. The investors thanked Grace politely as she cleared the dishes. Each one gave her a small nod, and she responded with her usual calm smile. Mr. Howard, however, hardly noticed her anymore. His mind was busy with thoughts of contracts, signatures, and the grand deal he believed was already his. When the investors stood to leave, he shook their hands firmly. "I look forward to finalizing everything tomorrow," he said with a wide smile. They returned his handshake, but their faces were unreadable. They offered polite words: "Yes, we will speak more tomorrow," but something in their tone was quiet, almost distant. Mr. Howard did not notice. He walked away certain that the night had secured his success. But for the investors, the story was different. Later that night, in a private lounge at their hotel, the group gathered around a long wooden table. The room was quiet, the city lights glowing through the tall windows. They had folders of documents, reports, and charts spread before them. Yet none of them reached for the papers immediately. Their minds were still on what they had seen at the restaurant. Mr. Daniel, the most experienced of them, leaned back in his chair and spoke first. His voice was calm but thoughtful. "Gentlemen, I know we came here tonight to make a decision about this deal. We have heard the numbers. We know the profits look strong. But I cannot stop thinking about something else." The others nodded silently. They knew what he meant without him even saying it. "It was not the business talk," Mr. Daniel continued, "but the way Mr. Howard treated the young waitress. That moment showed me more about his leadership than any chart he placed in front of us." One of the other investors, Mr. Lee, spoke next. "I agree. Numbers can look good, but business is about trust. If he cannot show respect to someone serving his meal, what will happen when we question him about money? Will he treat us with the same arrogance?" Another man, Mr. Patel, folded his hands and added, "I noticed the same." The girl, Grace, she handled everything with dignity. She smiled, she helped others, even after his harsh tone. She showed more strength than he did. And she had no reason to perform. It was simply who she was. The group grew quiet again, each lost in thought. The decision before them was not small. $200 million was a powerful number, enough to change companies and futures. But each man in the room knew that money alone could not build lasting success. Character mattered. Mr. Daniel finally said, "I have learned in my life that success without respect is failure in disguise. We must choose carefully who we attach our names to. A partner with arrogance can destroy not only his own reputation but ours as well." The others nodded in agreement. Slowly, the papers on the table lost their importance. The graphs and profits no longer shined so brightly. What stood clear in their minds was the simple image of Grace, standing tall with quiet strength, and the sharp contrast of Mr. Howard, sitting proud but careless with his words. Mr. Lee leaned forward. "So what shall we decide? Do we move forward or do we walk away?" The room grew still. Each man thought of the risks, the rewards, and the values they held close. Finally, Mr. Daniel gave the answer that was already written in their hearts. "We walk away," he said firmly. "No matter how much money is on the paper, we cannot trust a man who does not respect others. That is not leadership, it is weakness disguised as power." The decision was final. One by one, the investors agreed. They would cancel the deal in the morning. Outside the hotel, the city continued to shine with lights, cars moving quickly on the streets below. Mr. Howard, in his home across town, slept peacefully, dreaming of the grand announcement he would make about his company's new deal. He had no idea that his own actions had already written a different ending. Meanwhile, Grace was walking home after her long shift. The night air was cool, and the stars sparkled faintly above her. Her feet ached, but she carried herself with the same calmness she had shown all evening. She thought only of resting, of waking up tomorrow to do her work again. She had no idea that her patience and dignity had touched the hearts of powerful men she did not even know. And so, in two different places, two very different futures were quietly unfolding, one of loss, one of unexpected hope. The choice had been made, not in the boardroom, but in the quiet moments of a restaurant, in the way one person chose respect and another chose pride. The investors closed their folders, packed away the papers, and rose from their seats. Their path was clear. Tomorrow, Mr. Howard would hear their answer, and the weight of his own words would fall back on him. The morning sun rose gently over the city. The tall buildings shone in golden light, and the streets slowly filled with people beginning their day. For many, it was just another morning. But for Mr. Howard, it was the morning of triumph. He woke early, dressed in his finest suit, and admired himself in the mirror. His tie was perfectly straight, his shoes polished until they shone. He smiled at his reflection, already imagining the headlines that would soon appear in the business newspapers: "Howard secures $200 million deal." As he drove to the investor's office, his mind raced with plans. He thought about expanding his company into new cities, about hiring more staff, and about the recognition he would gain from his rivals. He imagined the applause at conferences and the admiration of other leaders. By the time he reached the tall glass building where the investors were staying, his chest was filled with confidence. He stepped out of his car and walked inside with quick strides, greeting the receptionist as though the place already belonged to him. The investors were already waiting in a large meeting room on the top floor. The room was filled with morning light, its wide windows opening to the busy city below. A long table stood in the center, with documents neatly placed at one end. Mr. Howard entered with a wide smile. "Good morning, gentlemen," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I trust you slept well. Today is the day we make history together." The investors rose politely and shook his hand, but their faces were calm, without the excitement he expected. They gestured for him to sit. Mr. Howard settled into the chair at the head of the table, his heart racing with pride. "I have prepared the final details for our agreement," he said confidently. "I believe you will be very pleased with the terms." Mr. Daniel, sitting across from him, placed his hands on the table. He looked at Mr. Howard with steady eyes. "Mr. Howard, we appreciate the dinner last night and the effort you have made to present your company to us. We have carefully considered everything." Mr. Howard nodded quickly. Of course. And I trust you see the potential." There was a pause. The silence stretched a little longer than he liked. Finally, Mr. Daniel spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "After much thought, we have decided not to move forward with this deal." The words struck Mr. Howard like cold water. He blinked in disbelief. "Not move forward? Gentlemen, surely you must be joking. The numbers are clear. The profits are undeniable." Mr. Lee spoke next, his tone polite but unwavering. "The numbers are strong, yes. But numbers are not everything. A partnership is built on trust, on respect, on character." Mr. Howard frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I have proven my leadership. I have shown my company's growth." Mr. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Last night, you showed us something else as well. You showed us how you treat people who have no power over you. That told us more than your charts ever could." For a moment, the room felt still. Mr. Howard's face tightened as he remembered the dinner. His mind went back to the moment with the waitress Grace. The small mistake, his sharp tone, the words he had spoken without thought. "You cannot be serious," he said quickly, his voice rising slightly. "You would throw away a deal of this size because of a minor incident with a server." Mr. Patel shook his head gently. "It was not minor to us. If a man cannot respect someone who serves him food, how can he respect partners who may one day disagree with him? Business is not just about money, Mr. Howard. It is about trust, and last night you lost ours." The words hung heavy in the air. Mr. Howard sat back, his confidence slipping away. He tried to recover, forcing a smile. "Gentlemen, surely we can put aside one misunderstanding. Think of the benefits, think of the growth we can achieve together." But the investors did not bend. Mr. Daniel closed the folder in front of him and stood. "Our decision is final. We wish you success in your future, but this partnership is not for us." One by one, the investors gathered their papers, shook his hand politely, and left the room. Their footsteps faded down the hallway until only silence remained. Mr. Howard sat alone at the long table, the sunlight pouring in around him. His hands tightened into fists. $200 million had just slipped from his grasp, not because of numbers, but because of something far simpler. A careless moment, a sharp word, a lack of respect. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of regret. Across the city, Grace was finishing her morning chores before heading back to the restaurant for another long shift. She tied her apron, brushed back her hair, and prepared for the day ahead. She had no idea that the man who had spoken so sharply to her was now facing the greatest loss of his career, and that her quiet strength had played a role in shaping it. Two lives, so different, were quietly moving forward. One carried pride and regret, the other carried patience and dignity. And in the end, the world had chosen which one to reward. The next evening at the restaurant began just like any other. Grace arrived on time, tying her apron neatly and greeting her co-workers with a polite smile. She had worked there long enough that most nights felt the same, serving tables, carrying heavy trays, and offering warm words to customers who needed them. She did not think much about the group from the night before. To her, it was just another busy dinner shift. Yes, the man at the head of the table had spoken sharply, but she had met such customers before. She had learned not to carry their words home with her. Instead, she carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done her best. As the evening grew busier, Grace moved from table to table with her usual calmness. She helped an elderly couple find their seats, guided a family with children through the menu, and poured drinks for a group of friends celebrating a birthday. Her steps were steady, her smile gentle, her voice soft but clear. Then, halfway through her shift, the manager called her to the side. He was a kind man with gray hair and glasses, though usually serious about keeping the restaurant running smoothly. Tonight, however, there was a softer look in his eyes. "Grace," he said quietly, "a group of gentlemen has asked to meet you. They are waiting in the private room upstairs." Grace blinked in surprise. "Me? Are you sure?" The manager nodded. "Yes. They asked for you by name." For a moment, Grace's heart raced. She wondered if she had done something wrong, but the manager gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry. Just go and see what they want." She untied her apron, smoothed her uniform, and walked carefully toward the private room. Her hands felt a little nervous, but her steps were steady as always. When she entered the room, she saw them immediately, the same group of investors from the night before. They were sitting around the polished wooden table, but tonight there were no business papers, no charts, and no fancy meals in front of them. Instead, they were waiting quietly, their expressions kind. One of them, Mr. Daniel, stood as she entered. "Grace," he said warmly, "thank you for coming." Grace gave a small bow, her voice polite. "Good evening, sir. How may I help you?" Mr. Daniel smiled. "You have already helped us more than you know. We came here last night for a business meeting, but what stayed with us was not the meal or the numbers, it was you." Grace blinked, unsure what he meant. "Me?" "Yes," said Mr. Lee, another investor. "We saw how you carried yourself, even when someone spoke to you without kindness. You did not answer back with anger. You remained calm, respectful, and kind. That told us more about character than anything else we saw that evening." Grace lowered her eyes, feeling her cheeks warm. "I was only doing my job." Mr. Daniel shook his head gently. "No. You were showing us what true dignity looks like. That is rare. And we want to honor it." Grace looked up, surprised. "Honor it?" The men exchanged a smile. Then Mr. Patel spoke. "Tell us, Grace, what is your dream? If you could do anything in life, what would it be?" Grace hesitated. She had never been asked such a question by strangers, especially not by men in fine suits. Slowly, she said, "My dream is to one day open a small cafe. A place where people can come not just to eat, but to feel welcome, to feel at peace. I want to create a place filled with kindness." The investors nodded, as though her words touched something inside them. Mr. Daniel then reached into his briefcase and placed an envelope on the table. "Grace," he said softly, "we would like to help you begin that journey. Inside this envelope is the support you need to start your cafe. Consider it a gift, not just from us, but from the lesson you gave us last night." Grace stared at the envelope, her heart racing. I don't understand." "Why me?" Mr. Lee smiled gently. "Because you showed us what real leadership looks like. Not with wealth, not with loud words, but with quiet strength. You reminded us that respect is the foundation of everything. We want to invest not only in businesses, but also in people like you." For a moment, Grace could not speak. Tears filled her eyes, and she quickly wiped them, embarrassed. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much." Mr. Daniel stood and placed a hand gently over his chest. "No, Grace. We are the ones who should thank you. Without you, we might have made a very different decision yesterday. But you reminded us what truly matters. Grace held the envelope carefully, her hands trembling. It felt heavy, not just with opportunity, but with hope. She bowed deeply to the men. I will not forget this kindness. I promise I will use it well. The investors smiled, knowing their decision had been the right one. They had walked away from arrogance, and now they had chosen to lift someone who carried humility. When Grace left the private room, her heart was lighter than it had ever been. She returned to her work with a glow in her smile that others noticed but could not explain. She had come to the restaurant that night expecting only another shift, but instead she carried with her the first step toward her dream. And somewhere across the city, Mr. Howard sat in his office, staring at empty contracts, wondering how everything had slipped away so suddenly. Grace, however, walked with hope in her heart, unaware that her journey was only just beginning. Months passed, and life began to change in quiet but beautiful ways for Grace. The envelope she had received from the investors had not only carried the funds she needed but also their trust in her dream. With careful planning, wise steps, and the support of a few kind friends, Grace rented a small corner shop on a quiet street. She named it Haven Cafe. From the very first day, Grace poured her heart into every detail. The wooden chairs were simple but polished, the tables always clean, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air each morning. She decorated the walls with soft colors and paintings of peaceful landscapes. Her goal was not just to sell food and drinks but to give people a space where they could feel at home, no matter who they were. And people noticed. At first, only a few neighbors stopped by: an elderly woman who lived alone, a young man who worked nearby, and a group of children curious about the sweet muffins displayed in the window. Grace greeted each one with the same kindness, remembering their names, their favorite drinks, and even the stories they shared with her. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, the cafe became a gathering place. Business workers, families, students, and travelers found themselves drawn not only to the food but also to the warmth that Grace carried in her smile. Many said the cafe felt different, gentle, calm, and full of peace. Grace often stood behind the counter, her hands busy serving, her heart quietly grateful. She thought often about the night in the restaurant, when those kind investors had seen her not as just a waitress, but as a person with dignity and dreams. Without their belief, she might never have had this chance. One evening, as the cafe lights glowed softly, a group of the same investors visited her new place. They entered quietly, smiling as they saw the little cafe filled with life and laughter. Grace welcomed them warmly, guiding them to a table in the corner. "This place is beautiful," Mr. Daniel said, looking around. Grace bowed her head modestly. "It is small, but it is filled with love." Mr. Lee added, "Small things often hold the greatest meaning." "You have done well, Grace. You have turned your dream into reality." Grace thanked them, her heart swelling with gratitude. She promised she would continue to serve people with the same respect and care she always had. But while Grace's life was moving forward, another story was unfolding across the city. Mr. Howard, the once proud CEO, was struggling. The deal he had lost that night had shaken his company, and the news had spread quickly among investors. Many began to doubt his leadership, not only because of the failed partnership but also because of the pride and sharpness he had shown. He tried to recover, calling new meetings, chasing new deals, but something had changed. Business partners no longer trusted him the way they once did. They looked for leaders who carried not only wealth but also wisdom. One day, tired and restless, Mr. Howard wandered the city streets alone. His thoughts were heavy, his steps slow. By chance, he passed a small cafe with a warm light glowing through its windows. The sign above the door read Haven Cafe. Something about the name and the gentle smell of fresh bread drew him inside. When he entered, he froze. Behind the counter, wearing a simple apron and a warm smile, stood Grace. She did not notice him at first, busy serving a customer. But when she turned and saw him, her eyes widened slightly. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Mr. Howard cleared his throat. "Grace," he said quietly, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Grace nodded politely. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Haven Cafe." Her words were simple, without pride or bitterness, only kindness. Mr. Howard sat down at a table, and Grace came over with a small menu. She spoke gently, as she did with all her customers. "Would you like tea or coffee?" He hesitated, then whispered, "Tea, please." As Grace walked away, Mr. Howard's eyes wandered around the cafe. He saw families laughing together, students quietly studying, an old man sipping soup with peace in his face. The atmosphere was calm, filled with warmth. When Grace returned with his tea, he looked at her for a long moment. Finally, he said softly, "I lost much that night. But I think I understand why now." Grace placed the tea in front of him and folded her hands politely. She did not remind him of the past, nor did she speak of the deal. She simply said, "Sometimes life takes away what we think is important, only to show us what truly matters." Mr. Howard lowered his head. For the first time in many years, he felt humbled not by loss of money, but by the quiet strength of someone he had once overlooked. He sipped the tea slowly. It was simple, warm, and soothing, much like Grace herself. When he left the cafe that night, he paused at the door. "Thank you, Grace," he said softly, though she was busy with other customers and may not have heard. Outside, the city lights shimmered, and for the first time in a long while, Mr. Howard felt a small spark of reflection in his heart. As for Grace, she continued to serve each day with steady hands and a kind heart. Her cafe grew, not into a grand empire, but into something greater, a place where people felt seen, respected, and valued. And that was her true success. Because in the end, money could be lost, deals could fail, and titles could fade. But the lesson of respect and dignity remained forever, touching lives quietly, like the warmth of a simple cup of tea.